Can the rich man be saved? That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Before I jump into today's episode, I do have one quick announcement. So those of you who listen to this podcast regularly, you'll recall that sometime back, I mentioned that I'd be teaching a college-level course that would be available to all podcast listeners. And in keeping with that, we went ahead and we launched a survey to find out what you, dear listeners, would like to learn from me. Well, that survey is now closed and done, and the results are in. And drum roll, we have two classes that took the lead as most interesting to you, our listenership. Those are Introduction to Philosophy, so this general survey of philosophy, which, that's we know, Dr. Jacobs, that's what introduction means. And then the second one that was of great interest was Ancient and Medieval Philosophy. So, in light of those results, those two coming in neck and neck, here is what I am going to do. I'm going to be offering Introduction to Philosophy. Details to come, but it'll be available to all of my listeners. And if there's sufficient interest in that class, then on the heels of that, I'll go ahead and I'll offer a second class, Ancient and Medieval Philosophy. And candidly, that's probably the right order of procedure. If you've never taken a philosophy class, it's not a bad idea to go ahead and take an introduction class to get those basics under your belt before jumping into something more specialized. So we'll see how it goes. Now, like I said, when I first announced this will be a 3-credit-hour course. It'll be accredited. So if you are a college student or you're a high school student who's ambitious and you'd like to take a college class, this will be an accredited class. You'll be able to get a transcript that demonstrates that this is a 3-credit-hour college-level introduction class. And you'll be able to transfer that or try to transfer that to whatever school you like. Now, for those of you who are not interested in grades or in credit or any of that sort of stuff, we will also have an audit option. So if you just want to sit in on the class and be able to listen to the lectures and ask questions and do that sort of thing, that will be available as well. Be watching for details. In the next few weeks, we'll be going ahead and announcing when that class will be launching and give you a link to where you can go in order to register and sign up for the class and all the rest. Like I said, details to come. Be watching for that in the coming weeks. Oh, and one more thing. I've noticed that some of you have yet to subscribe. I'm looking at you, Tyrone. Hey, Kevin, don't you laugh. I see you there in the back. So go ahead and hit subscribe. And for all my subscribers, thank you for your support. Go ahead and hit like, throw something in the comments. All of that really helps us out, and tell your friends. So with that, back to the show. Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. I am here today with my special guest, very special guest, Charles Lelon. Sorry, Chuck. I'm so accustomed to calling you Chuck that I should formally introduce you. So welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Nathan, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Exciting.
So,
and scary.
Yeah. Well, don't you worry. It'll be relatively painless, I'm sure. So, today on the podcast, we're doing something a little bit unusual. I mean, we explore all sorts of topics on any number of issues here, oftentimes related to philosophy, theology, all those sorts of things. But today, I want to actually talk about something that's a little bit peculiar, which has to do with this intersection between, wealth, riches, things like that, and the question of how that intersects with the ascetic life, which is something that's not typically talked about, as you yourself have discovered.
Yes.
trying to find out whether anybody sort of explores these sorts of issues. Now, before I jump into that, though, I'd like to kind of introduce you as well as talk a little bit about our relationship and how we know each other and why you're a great candidate to dialogue with me about this topic. So give us a little bit for folks who don't know, which, would probably be the majority of my audience. The majority of my audience probably doesn't know Chuck Lelon. Give us a little bit of a bio in terms of you and your background, which is a little bit peculiar because you're, on the one hand, you're trained in like philosophy and theology, but also you're a businessman.
That's right.
And so just like me, who has a very eclectic and unusual background, you've got an unusual background as well. So why don't we start with your bio,
Okay.
and we can get to how we know each other.
Well, happy to do that. And the eclectic natures of our background, I think, is one of the reasons why we hit it off right away.
I think you're right. Yeah.
So let's see. I studied religion, comparative religion, and philosophy for many years, both at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level. And I found that to be my passion.
Right. Well, you're being too humble, Chuck. Where did you study it, and who did you study under? I mean, these are notable names.
Yeah. So I went to Harvard College, did my master's in theology, or theological studies, technically, at Harvard Divinity School. One of my mentors was Hilary Putnam, the philosopher, I had originally wanted to be a doctor and had a very bad freshman year, and one thing led to the other, and I found my passion. And I found my, not only I loved it, I was good at it. And in the process of trying to figure out what did I want to do with my life, I was trying to figure out a way to make a living. I was going to be getting married and make a living, but somehow pursue this passion.
Now, just to clarify, because some people who listen to this show, they hear Dr. Jacobs and they might be confused and think you wanted to become the kind of doctor that doesn't make money. But no, my understanding is that your original intent was a doctor who does a medical doctor.
A medical doctor. That's right. That's right. I was pre-med. And for whatever reason, as a kid, I thought a way to serve and contribute to society and also make a living was, to be a doctor. And for whatever reason, I focused on that from a very young age. But when I got to Harvard, those dreams fell apart in chemistry and calculus at the college level anyway.
But you discovered the wonders of philosophy.
But I discovered the wonders of philosophy walking into the back of Hilary Putnam's, I think it was Phil 149, Philosophy of Language. And it was like I was hearing... I completely understood what he was talking about and was fascinated by it. And anyway, so while I was doing this, this is now in the 80s, and coverage of religion in the major media had begun to shrink and disappear. And so where in the 60s you'd have regular religion beats in all the major newspapers and in the news magazines, all of that was disappearing. And I thought, well, maybe I could create a magazine about the world of religion and its importance, which most of the faculty at the time felt like it was going the other way, that religion was becoming trivial and private and would never have a place in the public sphere anymore. Of course, this was the rise of the moral majority, and so they were already kind of back in the public sphere. Religion was starting to take a place again in the public sphere in America. Anyway, and I did that. And I launched a magazine as an undergraduate and fell in love with the business of publishing magazines and wanted to learn how to do that. Was doing it at the graduate level. I was trying to create a charter issue to launch an actual, business venture, because my mentors, Reverend Peter Gomes and Professor Diana Eck, thought that the world needed it and I should do that rather than create a university publication. And I'm the child of two educators. And so I was very naive, didn't know anything about business, put a charter issue together, went out and was trying to raise money. And people were like, who's going to publish it? And I said, I'm going to be the publisher. And they were like, oh, really? Yeah. And I quickly realized that I knew nothing about the business of publishing, and I had to learn how to do that. And I went off and eventually ended up in a venture capital firm called Summit Partners, and started to learn about business. And eventually that led to me getting an MBA, and
also Harvard,
at Harvard Business School. And then there was only two investment firms that invested in magazines at the time. Summit didn't do it, and that's why I was looking for another firm where they would invest in, either early stage or later stage magazine publishing operations. And it was called Verona Suler. I was in New York, and I ended up getting the job. And so I went down there and was learning a lot about magazine publishing, and it was really coming together. And then this little thing called the internet happened.
Oh, I've heard of it.
Yes. Right. And I learned enough about magazines by then to think, okay, I don't know anything about technology and software, and this is really going to disrupt the magazine industry. And I had a 9-month-old baby. And so I sort of accidentally ended up in private equity, and I made a career of it. And so I've been in private equity for 34 years now as an investor. And I shelved that magazine idea, but I never lost my passion for both entrepreneurship and theology and philosophy.
Yes, so that's great. And that sort of dovetails with how we met.
Yes.
And so we met at a conference put on by a mutual friend, acquaintance, colleague, business acquaintance. I don't know how you would frame our relationship with Charles, but
that's fair.
Yeah, and so he had put together this conference of different folks from different organizations, or folks that he thought needed support with other people he thought could provide support, and so on. And that was, and I was one of those people that Charles invited into that circle because I just completed this documentary, Becoming Truly Human, on the religiously unaffiliated. And I was starting to branch out into this crazy venture that I was going to do filmmaking and try to impact culture and things like that. And so Charles invited me there, showed this film, and then and that's how you were in the audience, and that's how we started getting to talk. So rather than me telling that story, you want to sort of give a little bit of an insight into what clicked with you. I mean, I know how I recall it. But,
Right. Well, I was listening to you kind of give your talk, and then we watched Becoming Truly Human. Actually, maybe we watched the film first, and then you gave your talk, and it happened. And as you were talking about your project, it was just sort of an aha moment because I'd been studying about the secularization of our culture, and I was thinking myself about how to impact that. And I'd always had an interest in media. And so I was just fascinated by the documentary, but also more importantly by you and sort of some of the ideas you were just kind of very touching on them. And so I went up to you afterwards, and we got to talking. We found some time a little later to get together to talk. And I think we talked for like 2 or 3 hours or something.
Yeah. Well, what I remember most was that, you were like, yeah, I'm in private equity. Let's find some time to talk. And then the first thing you wanted to ask me was about my book on Immanuel Kant. And I thought, well, that's unusual. That's not normally where a prospective investor begins, is tell me your thoughts on Kant. But then that's when I started realizing, there's this odd intersect where you studied philosophy, you studied religion, you saw the importance of media in terms of engaging culture. And so that was the start of not just a friendship, but also us starting to work together as I was venturing out in this crazy exploration of trying to engage, do film or explore film and television, things like that, and use it as a vehicle for engaging the world of ideas, philosophy, religion, and all the rest. So,
and that's right. And the reason I asked you about Kant was because it was clear from the way in which you were, talking about why you were doing what you were doing. You were just coming at it from a different angle than most folks, sort of whether they're in the church or whether they're, trying to promote Christianity, or it was a much more sophisticated take on it. And it dovetailed very nicely with a lot of thoughts I had over the years. And so that there was just an immediate connection. And then the conversation that went on, it was just clear that. And then in that conversation, I think it was the same conversation, right? You mentioned, the nuns and their relationship.
Yeah.
To
They Dwell Among Us was already a project that was in the works. We were already sort of teasing it out and exploring connections with Lionsgate and other studios. So for folks who maybe haven't heard me talk about this, you could go and listen to my interview with Father Maximus McIntyre. And so he's an Orthodox priest who worked with Ed and Lorraine Warren, who are the sort of basis for the Conjuring movie franchise, which is this multi-billion-dollar, biggest horror franchise ever, second to Godzilla, actually, which I didn't think of Godzilla as horror. So if you bracket that, it's the biggest, but apparently that's considered the biggest. That's it. It's true. It's true. And they just can't stop making them, but anyway, so that project, that my relationship with Father Maximus was deeply tied in with this intersection between the very thing that you had mentioned about the nuns, is that when I was, and I always have to do the obligatory for those who don't know this, nuns, we're not talking about like Catholic or Orthodox nuns, religious nuns. We're talking about NONES, people with no religious affiliation. They are none of the above when it comes to religion. That's right. And so that was all what all the Becoming Truly Human was all about, right? It was about that demographic, and they're wandering away from religion and all of the rest. And so in engaging with them, I noticed this unusual interest in the paranormal and the occult, and I wasn't the only one to notice it. There were other researchers like Clay Rutledge who had noticed it. And so I really wanted to use the paranormal film genre, which was extremely popular. And I had suggested that at least part of the movement away from religion was contributing to the rise in popularity of those things as a way of really engaging ideas of philosophy and religion and worldview in a very sort of mainstream, storytelling film way. And then that intersected with Father Maximus, who had experience in that department and so on. So yeah, that project was already underway, and I know that we started talking about that eventually after we finished talking about a whole lot of philosophy. But that's, the importance of that project and the years that we devoted to looking at that, it gets to the topic that I want to chat with you about today. So along the way, we had we were exploring this idea of talking with investors about using story and media, which was basically, you had wanted to do that in the magazine realm with your original idea, and you were seeing a more sort of modern version of that and what I was proposing with film and television, and so we wanted to explore whether there were investors who were willing to get behind that. But along the way, one of the things that we noticed was this sort of odd, peculiar bifurcation in the minds of a lot of investors, where you would have investors who, on the one hand, they're sort of, okay, they're Christians, they're mission oriented, they want to engage. Oh yeah, we like this. You talk to them about mission. Oh, engaging culture. Yes, reaching culture, affecting culture. These are all great. Yeah. And that sort of resonates with this one spiritual part of them. And then the moment you say, now invest, there's like this switch that would flip. And all of a sudden it's all assessing ROI and the business model and risk averse and all this sort of stuff that it's like, it's so deeply ingrained that there was this sort of weird bifurcation and so difficult to bridge. And we ran into that over and over and over again. And more recently, what I've noticed, we saw that on the ground and encountered that on the ground. But more recently, you reached out to me because you'd been exploring this idea of how does a person who is a business person, how is somebody who has been involved in investing and things like that, how does that part of their life relate, if it does relate, to ascesis or spiritual exercise? What is the bridge between, say, being an Orthodox Christian, which you are, right? So you're an Eastern Orthodox Christian like me. What is the bridge between the spiritual life and the business life? Is there a bridge between those, or are these just destined to be, ne'er the two shall meet? And so you reached out to me and about that, and the fact that you had been writing on that, you had been thinking on that, and you wanted to dialogue about that. And I was really intrigued reading the sorts of things that you wrote. And that's exactly why I invited you on the podcast, because I actually restrained myself from talking with you about it in advance, reacting to your writing, specifically because I thought it was so fascinating and such a worthwhile discussion. Because, you tell me, you started going down this road and doing research yourself, right? The question of, what's the relationship between like business and the spiritual life or something like that? And it sounds like you came up relatively empty in terms of resources on that. Do you want to, what did you, when you started exploring this, like, what did you find?
Yeah, well, I think about it as the problem of, can a life in business kind of be a legitimate path to holiness, or a legitimate form of excuses, as you mentioned. And so there's a lot written about wealth. There's a lot written about the negative implications of wealth. There's a lot written, and I didn't say there's a lot. There's some Orthodox scholars write about capitalism in general or economics, but it tends to be very critical. I was not able to find a kind of a constructive engagement between Orthodox theology and modern American, say, capitalism, and frankly, capitalism in general. What really happened was I'd heard I don't recall exactly how, but I'm guessing I heard the parable of the young rich man again when I was in liturgy, and it just struck me a different way a couple of years ago, and that I started to think about that parable, and then that I started to write about it, and I got fascinated with the parable itself and looked for commentary on the parable. And the way it had struck me differently, I couldn't find any commentary that supported my my own personal reflections on it. There was nothing that kind of looked at that parable the way I was beginning to look at it. And as the more I thought about the parable and wrote and researched, the more this question came to mind, which is, what's the connection? And then, as you said, when we were out looking for investors, this flip that switches between when the people have sort of a philanthropic bucket, and then they have sort of managing their money, making investment bucket. And that's true of institutions as well as, people with family offices, as well as just wealthy individuals. And I in my professional life, we do impact investing. That's part of our mission. And you see it there as well. You have to fit in these very specific buckets. And I think a lot of that has to do with just culturally how we think about wealth and its purposes, and more importantly, the relationship of generating it, relationship to generate it, the path to generating it. There's not a lot about that. There's a lot about, once you have it, what do you do with it, right? And the parable of the young rich man, it's very clear: sell it all and distribute it to the poor, and then follow me. It's very clear in this parable. It's very stark, and it ought to make anybody who has any means, not even great wealth, what does that mean? Because that means we're all supposed to just give it away, sell it, give it away. And what's more importantly is there's really no discussion either in the commentaries or, there's the parable of the talent that talks a little bit about making the wealth. And in fact, Jesus in the parable, or the Lord in the parable, is a very tough, investor, right? I mean, is very upset that the first servant preserved capital, which usually in the investment world is a tremendous success. It's if you don't preserve capital, that's number one. So it's a good thing. In that parable, the Lord's quite angry, but that's all that was done.
So yeah, I think this is an interesting topic. And the reason I find it interesting is because obviously, obvious to me anyway, that we're in a culture that is unusually wealthy relative to world history. And so, as you pointed out, there's a tendency when we think about the wealthy is that folks are like, yeah, those other people who aren't me, not thinking about the fact that, the average American household and how they live and what they have is, like royalty of certain times. And so there should be something sobering about these passages that are talking about wealth, because oftentimes when it comes up, it's really troubling. Christ in the parable, and we can talk about the parable as we delve into your exploration of it. But he says this very shocking thing about it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And so That should be sobering.
Well, I mean, it's like I've thought, has my career salvifically slimmed me or fattened me?
Right. And I think there's a tendency, there's one of the things that I've noticed is there's a tendency to try to interpret that away, right? That has to do with just him, right? It doesn't have to do with you and me. Or it's just supposed to be sobering, but the gospel lets us know that we all fall short. And there's all these sorts of efforts to usually try to take the sting out of that and to not leave anybody uncomfortable with it. But I'm not sure that we should be so quick to put ourselves at ease whenever looking at something that Christ says that is uncomfortable. And so let's talk a little bit about the parable. Maybe if you want me to, I can kick off by recounting the parable, and you can make any corrections or adjustments or additions. Okay.
Sure.
So you have this rich young ruler or rich young man who comes to Christ, as many people did, and he asks him, like, what do I need to do to be saved? And Christ looks on him and he loves him. So he's not looking on him with scorn. He looks at him favorably. He loves him. And Christ recounts these commandments. Like, okay, well, so here's some commandments, right? You've heard of these, right? And then he basically responds, I've done these since I was a youth. Okay, so what do I lack? Right? What else? And he says, sell everything you have and give it to the poor and come follow me. And his face, he gets hangdog, or he gets he's deeply disappointed, right, in some way, and because he's a man of great wealth, right, and he goes away, and then that's where Christ says exactly the thing that I talked about, right, about how difficult it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so anything that you think is critical that I missed that you'd like to add in there?
Just the way in which the young, so first of all, it's common to, looking at the commentaries that in Protestant circles, it's often referred to as the young rich ruler. The word is archon, and it really doesn't mean ruler. When we hear ruler, we're thinking of somebody that's, rules over a geography or an organization or something like that. Archon is much more of like an official. And so I chose to just focus on only one of the Gospels, Synoptic Gospels, mentions the ruler, the archon. And almost anybody of great wealth would have some official title in the ancient world, sure, right? And so I think of it's more of an executive or an official or something like that who's a young man. So that's one thing I think that's important. I think the youth is important. Two of the Synoptic Gospels, either one says it explicitly, the others imply it. In the way in which this young man comes to Jesus, he runs up to Jesus and he kneels down and shows great respect. This is not like the lawyer who asks the same question of Jesus, and then he tries to defend himself. This young man doesn't do that. These are some of the nuances that hit me when I started to think about this, having heard it, I don't know how many hundreds of times, because the conclusion is, by all the sermons I've ever heard and the commentaries that I've seen, is that he turns away from Jesus, right? He walks away, as you said, and the Gospels say because he was exceedingly wealthy. And the conclusion is he couldn't give up his wealth. So he was turning away from God because he couldn't let go of his wealth. And I don't see the evidence of that. That's what struck me for the first time. And having been involved in managing money, other people's money, and I was going through a pretty difficult time too. And I think that's probably why this struck me a different way, as so often the Gospels do. You can read the same text for decades, and then because of what's going on in your heart or your life or your relationships or the world, all of a sudden it speaks to you in a totally different way. It's a living text. I thought, it's probably more complicated than that. This seems like an awfully simple way. I mean, here's a successful young, obviously a faithful Jew, clearly heard about Jesus, had enough interest to run after him, kneel before him, address him as good rabbi. And so there's that little subtle interchange that's, I think, important as well. And he seems genuinely looking for salvation. In his culture, the wealthy were favored by God. It was just understood that if you were wealthy, then obviously God favored you, right? That was very typical of Jewish culture at that time. And this is why later in the text, after Jesus talks about, how difficult it is for the rich to enter heaven, his disciples, the apostles, are like, what are you talking about? Then who possibly could enter the kingdom of heaven? Because if that guy can't enter the kingdom of heaven, and he's obviously favored by God, how can any of us? And so there's a little dialogue that goes on there.
Right. This is one of the disruptive things that happens oftentimes when Jesus interacts with certain assumptions like this in culture. So, for example, the blind man, right? Who sinned, him or his parents? And that's because in that culture it was presumed, like, obviously if you're born lame, you're born blind, this is the wrath of God manifest upon you, must indicate disfavor, right? And Jesus oftentimes disrupts these sorts of assumptions about God or about this sort of empirical evidence of a person relative to God. I mean, I think, for example, the very fact that Joachim and Anna, the parents of the Theotokos, right? They were barren for the majority of their life. And actually in the accounts, that's a point of great shame, because everybody presumed that must indicate there's something wrong with you, wrath of God. Now, of course, they have to go out. Joachim goes out and into the desert, and he fasts and he prays, and he's visited by Gabriel and all this, and they're blessed with a child. But again, a number of these assumptions were that, there's just empirical evidence that God favors this person and disfavors this person, which is often disrupted in the accounts.
Yep, exactly. And it is here. And so that was the other thing is the young man is walking away because he can't let go of his wealth, right? But he goes through this just think about like Bill Gates chasing after some quasi renegade or marginalized group of guys, running up to them as they're leaving the town, walking away from the town, and kneeling down before him. I mean, that's what's happening. Everybody knew that this guy was a big deal, sort of like Zacchaeus, So there's humility that's being expressed. There's authenticity. And every time I've heard this described, it's like he obviously, loves wealth more than God. That's always the conclusion.
Let me give you one more defense of the point, of the counterpoint that you're making from the Eastern Church Fathers. So one of the things that you see in Cyril of Alexandria when he's commenting on the Gospel of John, and John is referred to as the apostle whom Jesus loves. Okay. Cyril points out in his commentary on John, because the Eastern Church Fathers are really emphatic that God never shows arbitrary, favor, right? Because then they always appeal to Paul. God is not a respecter of persons, meaning God is actually fair and just. They always what Cyril actually suggests is the only reason Jesus would, since God is not a respecter of persons, favor John is because John is uniquely virtuous. And so he takes the apostle whom Jesus loves to mean that John was unique in virtue relative to the other apostles. It's not arbitrary favoritism, because God is not a respecter. He doesn't show favoritism.
It's fascinating. Because I did not know that. And when I was studying the text, I read, whom he loved, right? Or he looked upon him and loved him is actually, I think, how it's put. And I thought, well, wait a minute. How often has Jesus done that? And it turns out, at least my amateur research, there are only 5 folks that the Gospels say Jesus loved: John, Martha, Lazarus, I think Martha, Mary, Lazarus, and this guy.
Right. And
that stuck out. I was like, wait a minute,
If you read that with Cyril of Alexandria, that's not a small thing.
That's not a small thing.
And it indicates that he was virtuous.
Right.
Worthy of being loved.
Worthy of being loved.
Right.
So then I started thinking, well, why? Is there some other reason that he might have been so disappointed, so upset? Why is he so sorrowful? And the Greek word stignasos connotes, this is the word that describes his face. It connotes like a clouding over of his face, like stormy weather, like
his face darkened.
Yeah, or it fell, like a storm falling on on the horizon or something like that. So maybe that isn't, oh shucks, I love wealth more than God. Maybe that's not what I was hoping that I was going to hear from the rabbi, the good rabbi. I was really hoping he was going to say, come follow me. And I was going to get to use my wealth to support him. And maybe my life would make sense, right? Because he himself knew that his culture said you're favored by God, but something must have been missing for him. There must have been something missing, because why would he be chasing this ragtag group of, peripatetic, rabbis and apostles, right? And he felt something was missing, and maybe this rabbi was gonna help him find it. And I know in my own life, I've had this tension ever since I was in college. How do I take my passion for the gospel, and I take my passion for theology and the church, and how do I, live it in my career in an integrated way? There are these very superficial kinds of ways in which we think about this stuff and do this stuff. And I started looking for, is there somebody who can advise me on this? And it doesn't seem like there's much, right, at least in our tradition.
Well, I think, not to name any names, but I'm not sure that even where there is stuff written in other traditions that it's correct.
Well, yes, there's, ever since Weber, there's been a lot written about Christianity and capitalism and all of that. I think there's a lot of interesting things to consider there, but it's just Western Christianity has such a different lens, that it looks through. And it's hard for me to relate to that lens or to look through my own career through that lens. And so I was obviously trying to find a help in my own tradition to look at my career. And this parable really got me thinking. And so I started writing some essays about it, about different aspects of the parable.
Now, I do think one of the things that happens in our culture is, because my worry, at least, I won't say definitively because I don't know the minds or hearts of men, or women. I still use it in the archaic form, Chuck. I mean,
I know that this is because you're a medievalist.
But so I worry. Let me say that way. I worry that there is a self-justifying sort of approach. That there are people who don't want to be stuck with the discomfort that maybe they do live in a way that is not harmonious with Christianity. And they would like to remove the sting of that so that they can never read the passage again and not think about it, and it won't keep them up at night. I do worry that there's a bit of that. But at the same time, I also worry that there's a lack of nuance for those who say no, 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 no. And then they're basically like, yes, and that's why we should confiscate all the rich people's wealth and give it to the poor. And I think both of those lack nuance. I think both of those are failing to wrestle with the text and with tradition. And this is actually what I really like, is that you decide to look to history and tradition to try to unpack it. But before I go there, let's go ahead and raise the natural question. Okay, so it's interesting that there are good reasons you've named, reasons I've named, to think that the rich young ruler is not, or rich young archon. I actually kind of like just calling him an archon, because within the Greek church you have wealthy people who are branded archons. Which, have they thought about the connection with the passage? Is that intentional? Anyway, so we've raised some good reasons to be suspicious of the tendency to just indict him, right? Mm-hmm. And say maybe he's actually a virtuous guy. But the natural question is, well, so what does it mean? Like, why on earth, if he's going to, because it does give you the reason why his countenance falls, which is that he's a man of great wealth.
Exactly.
So if it's not covetous, what is it?
Exactly. And that's where I got stumped. And I started thinking about that. And I started thinking about it through the lens of my own career as a money manager. And I'm not that rich and I'm not that young anymore. But I was really, bothered by this. And I thought the other thing that struck me was unlike the calls that Peter and the sons of thunder, the sons of Zebedee, right? Mm-hmm. And the calls that they got, which is basically just follow me. It wasn't take care of your business. It was just follow me. And they more or less as far as we can tell, quickly took care of their business and said to their wives or whatever, I'm following this guy. But the point was, the command was follow me. Here, it's not follow me. It's very specifically, there's a sequence. It's sell everything. And it's not sell some of it. It's sell all of it. The Gospels are clear there. And and I've heard that rationalized constantly. The typical rationalization there is, well, Jesus was being pastoral. It was just for this individual. He clearly doesn't mean that everybody has to sell everything. So it was first sell all that you have, and then distribute to the poor, right? Or give to the poor. But the details of the sales and the distribution are left unspoken, right? Or we don't know. And I thought, so if I was a rich young man and I had exceedingly great wealth is the term, prodigious wealth, and I really loved this rabbi, and I really genuinely was kneeling there asking, what do I lack for my salvation? And Jesus said to me, sell everything you own and give it to the poor, I'd be bummed out.
Okay. Do tell, Chuck. Why?
It is a massively difficult task because I want to follow him. That's what I want. I want to do that as quickly as I can. In fact, if it were me, this is what I was thinking. And because I've had these exact thoughts in my life, I want to use the knowledge, the business knowledge, influence, my network, my resources to support this messianic revolution that I see going on here. Maybe that's what he's attracted by, or just the ministry, the good ministry that this man is doing. He's helping the poor, he's healing the blind and the lame, and I want to use my resources to help the ministry. And that would make me feel like my young life, I'm guessing he's probably in his, early mid-20s or something like that.
Right. Whatever young means in this context.
He probably started working very, much younger than we normally think of, but he's probably not 30, but somewhere in between, right? Mm-hmm. And that this would give meaning and purpose to the wealth that he's, created. I think of him, and this is anachronistic, obviously, but the fact that he runs, he drops to his knees, which incidentally, just another thing, running for a distinguished figure in the Hebrew culture would have been verboten, right? Like you don't you don't do that. A respectable, distinguished person doesn't do that sort of thing. So that's an act of abandon. That's right.
And humility.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And when I think of my first entity, I named Zacchaeus Ventures because he was my favorite until the young rich man. He was my favorite character in the Bible as a business person, because he seemed to have, he wanted so badly to see Jesus, he didn't care how ridiculous he looked. I mean, just imagine, Bezos climbing up a tree to see something because he was too short. I always get a chuckle out of that, and I love it. But instead, Jesus says, sell everything and give it to the poor. If I have, basically, what was wealth back in those days? So now I'm going to try to explain why this is difficult. What's wealth back in those? Typically, great wealth came from land and agrarian operations. Sure. And it often involves, servants and slaves and things like that. But I wasn't sure. I was just hypothesizing this. And I thought to myself, Zacchaeus, when Jesus told him to come down the tree, Zacchaeus immediately has this grand gesture where he says, Jesus says, come, I'm going to be in your household. So he's all excited. He comes down the tree. And I've always imagined Danny DeVito doing it. I always see the cinema. Danny DeVito scrambles up the tree and then he jumps down. He's all excited. And he playing Zacchaeus. And he says, I'm going to give half of my goods to the poor, and anybody I've defrauded, I'll repay fourfold. Wow. Big, wonderful gesture. And I think, well, why couldn't the rich young man do that? And I thought, well, what was Zacchaeus' business? Zacchaeus' business, he's one of these tax collectors. He's cash rich. His business is all about cash. So it'd be very easy for him to immediately say, here's half of everything, because he knows he's got plenty of cash reserves and he can restore people fourfold. That's very easy for him to do. he could meet the promise relatively quickly.
Right. Well as there's also with that an acknowledgement of what was deemed one of the great grievances of tax collectors, because in the ancient world, first of all, they're seen as traitors. They are totally traitors. Right. Because they're working with the Romans, right? And
worse than that, the Romans are like, you can screw your populace as much as you want. We don't care.
Right.
Just give us what we're owed.
Right. So rather than just coming, they're not just IRS agents who are like, here's the calculus. Like, we've done the calculation. This is what you owe. Instead it's whatever I can get from you, and then I take a portion of that. And so it's a complete free-for-all extortionist activity.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, I keep the margin. I know I got to give the Roman government X. If I can get 2X from you, I'm going to take 2X from you. If I can get 4X, I'll take 4X, and I keep the difference.
Right. And so the fact that Zacchaeus is like sitting there and saying, well, he's identifying one of the main things that you would have to repent of as a tax collector.
That's right.
Is defrauding people.
That's right.
And I'm going to make it right. I'm not just going to give it back. I'm going to give it back with interest, fourfold, right? And more than just interest, right? And so, no, I mean, so there's something about that I think you're quite right, that it does reflect sort of the nature of Zacchaeus' wealth.
Zacchaeus' wealth, exactly. Yeah. It's almost as though Zacchaeus says, my defrauding you is going to be one of the best investments of your life. You're going to make 4 times on it.
That's right.
But this young man, perhaps he was, we know he wasn't a tax collector, but we don't know what he was. We don't know the source of his wealth. The most common source of his wealth, as I was saying, is going to be very illiquid, meaning it's hard to turn it into cash. And that got me thinking, well, sure, that makes sense. If you're a smart business person, and obviously he was very successful, and so he's a smart business person, he understands the way markets work. He understands the concept of pricing and how illiquid markets cause dysfunctions with pricing. And so now he has a dilemma. The dilemma is, wait a minute now. Okay, so the Lord wants me to sell everything, and then I got to distribute it. Now, but he's not telling me, he's saying to sell everything, but he's not telling me how to sell it, and he's not telling me how to distribute it. I have to figure that out. I got to tell you, all of a sudden there's a moral dilemma that appears. What I would really like to do is follow the Lord as quickly as possible. That's what I want. That will make me happy. That will make me feel whatever, at peace, etc. But if I try to do this quickly, I'm only going to give a fraction of the value to the poor. This is the problem if you understand the markets. So essentially, there are 2 ways you can sell things, at least 2 ways, and in well-functioning markets, there's normal sales that are not distressed, meaning the buyers and sellers are not being forced by circumstance or time or whatever. They can just kind of take their time and come to a price. And when that happens in well-functioning markets, like we have here in America, more or less, they're not perfect, but in general, they function reasonably well. You say that the price is fair market. It's a fair value. And it typically, not always, it represents a fair amount of the actual, you can call it intrinsic value or something like that, of whatever the goods or service is. But if you're the rich young man, you know that if you decide, look, I want to unload all this as quickly as possible so I can follow Jesus. And by follow, I mean literally follow, because I think that's probably what he was probably hoping for, yeah. Right?
Mm-hmm. Right. It's not an abstract, I'm going to become a Christian and follow him in my daily life. This is literally follow him around.
Because in the gospel, when Jesus said, follow me, people literally got up and
walked. That's right. It is quite literal in that sense, yes.
Well, I'm thinking that's what he's thinking. And it would mean that he'd have to sort of unload in a distressed sale to, the other thing you have to realize is that, right, in Roman Palestine during Jesus's time, it's not like they have very high liquid, well-functioning markets. There are not a lot of people who have the wealth that could afford buying all of this young man's wealth or his assets. Think of his assets, quickly, and fairly. And so I started to think, am I thinking about this right? You know, is that the way the ancient world worked? Am I just being anachronistic here? Am I projecting my money management experience back into, you know, the ancient world? And I started to wonder, you know, are there any examples of this within the church? I started to talk to some scholars, and people were like, you know, nobody really is writing about any of this. And one scholar I talked to said, well, you might think of Melania the Younger. Now, she's a secular scholar, so she didn't refer to her as Saint Melania the Younger, but she's one of the saints of the church. And I delved into the life of Melania, and fascinating story, or fascinating life, because first of all, she's a woman, and she probably is one of the wealthiest women in Rome of the 4th century, right? The end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th century. She was the daughter of one of the most elite and prominent families, and she was the only daughter of one of the most elite and prominent families in Rome at the time. This is in like I said, I'd have to look it up, but
yeah, it's okay.
Where she's born, but it's like I want to say 30, like 6 or something like that. Anyway, and she doesn't want anything to do with her wealth. She wants to give her life to Christ, and she wants to become a monastic.
Right.
But her father doesn't want her to do that and forces her to marry. And she tries to convince her husband, let's just be celibate. And his family puts pressure on him. So they decide that they're going to have a few children. And after they have the few children, they fulfill those family obligations. And she's she's like 13 or 14 at the time. And he's, I don't know, 15 or 16 or something like that.
Right.
And they agree to do this. But what happens is their children pass away. And once that happens, they decide to devote themselves to the spiritual life. And around the same time, her father dies. And so all of his estate passes to her, and she becomes literally one of the wealthiest people, let alone women, let alone a 20-year-old. Mm-hmm. I think she's 20 years old when her father passes in the Roman Empire. And she wants to give all of her wealth away. In fact, she's specifically motivated by the parable of the young rich man.
Which is not unusual. There were a number of early saints who were prompted because in the liturgy they hear this. I believe St. Anthony is one. Mm-hmm. And so St. Anthony came from a relatively wealthy family, not nearly what you're about to describe. But I believe his parents were already passed, had already reposed. So he had a sister. This is all sort of vague in my memory, but I believe he had a sister. And so he ended up, based on this parable, he had to he did decide to get rid of his wealth and then become this desert monastic.
Right.
But the impression is that his wealth was more liquid than what you're about to describe. And that one of the things that he did, which this is instructive, he knew that he was responsible for his sister. So how he abandoned his own assets was in a way that made sure that she was taken care of.
Yes.
And then he went out and wore a hair shirt in the desert after that, after he had fulfilled his duties to, his sister to make sure that she was taken care of. But what you're describing is much more complicated than that.
Much more complicated, potentially, because we know for Melania it was much more complicated. And so what I began, and granted, a couple centuries had passed between Melania and the rich young man, but I don't think it stretches credulity that the lessons we can learn from Melania's life and her attempt to literally obey right. Christ's, I call it the divine sell order, which was sell everything you own. She decides to do this. And her husband, Pinion, who was also, by the way, came from one of the other top families. So this was like a Roman power couple like you've never seen before. These two young people had massive wealth.
So what does exceedingly great wealth mean, Chuck? I mean, obviously we don't know that the our archon is of this degree, but what did it mean for this couple?
We actually know because her biographer, her priest, I think we pronounce it Yerundas, details her life. And she probably is one of the few women of the ancient world that has such a detailed biography that goes with it. So we have a lot of good historical record. And basically, in the record, their annual income was 4,444 pounds of gold.
That's a lot of gold.
And that's annually, right? And so if you take the recent, spot price for gold, which is somewhere between 2,500. I mean, the calculation I'm going to do here is based on 2,500, but it's actually higher than that recently. That would be $178 million per year. And you're like, wow, that's
a lot.
It's a lot of money today.
That's a lot.
However, what that calculation does not take into account is the purchasing power difference between gold back in the ancient world and gold today, right? And so an academic estimated that this annual income that, again, they had about the same annual income, the couple, right? Each of them, that amount of income would essentially fund the lives of 16,800 average Roman families per year. So what's really great about that fact is we can now translate that into the purchasing power today. So instead of thinking about dollars per year, you think about how many families today could this money support. So 16,800 per member of the couple, 33,600 families together.
Right.
And today the average family generates $75,000 or requires about $75,000 per year in America, right? That's for the average family of four. And there are all kinds of nuances. Obviously, This is a very rough estimate, but it's just to give you a sense of the magnitude. You run that out, 75,000 times 33,600 families. Now you're talking $2.5 billion a year.
That's pretty good income.
That's right. It's massive. It's prodigious.
Yes.
Right? That's what exceedingly great wealth.
Yeah, I would call that exceedingly great. Yes.
Yes.
Are they interested in investing in films by chance?
Exactly. We'll come back to that problem, right?
Right.
So let's assume that the young rich man, it certainly does not have the wealth of the most elite Romans in all the empire. Okay. But let's say he's one of the elite in Roman Palestine. That's still a very significant geography with a lot of wealth, a lot of commerce. And, so even if it was a tenth of this or a 20th of this, we're talking massive wealth that's illiquid.
Mm-hmm.
Because what we see is Melania, she takes this literally. I'm going to literally sell her. And she starts to try to do it. And she quickly runs up against her own naivete. And she runs up against her family members who don't want this to happen. And there are all kinds of machinations that go on with her in-laws and other relatives. But luckily for Melania, she is very close to the empress. And so she finally has to call on the empress for help. Because this isn't going well. And the empress, she's very impressed with the holiness of this couple, and she doesn't want them to be interfered with. And so she offers to punish the family members that are, creating machinations. They're basically, they're fomenting revolt among the slaves. And so this is another aspect of Melania's wealth that may or may not be relevant for the young rich man, but Melania had thousands and thousands of servants and slaves that worked all of the agricultural estates that were strewn throughout the empire. And so when she decided they did not want to be sold. They wanted to retain their current life. They knew what it was stable.
Right. This is, by the way, always an important side to differentiate slave as we think of, the sort of abduction and beating and sort of non-personhood of a slave in sort of when we talk about American slavery versus basically indentured servitude or something like that, where for a lot of the ancient world, that was just your way of providing for your family and making an income. But
I mean, there's a whole aspect which I'll bracket, but I'm interested in further researching this is how, Melania does this. She succeeds in selling all of her wealth and distributing the proceeds to the poor. But one could ask, how well does she do that?
Sure.
Could she have done it better?
Mm-hmm.
And again, you have to be generous with her because, she wasn't educated to know how to do all this. And she might not understand that if you try to do this quickly, you're going to lose value.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Or that, other people will be, corrupted people will be taking shares of this. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's a whole moral, I think, very powerful, complex moral sets of questions about how do you sell great wealth or liquidate, let's put it that way, liquidate great wealth if your goal is to then distribute to the poor.
Mm-hmm. How long does it take her?
At least 13 years it takes her. And there's evidence that it actually took her, closer to, I want to say 40 years or 33 years, 34 years to actually be completely devoid of any wealth. So when you step back and you think about, and she had to travel for years to all of the estates that were strewn all over. And by the way, eventually, so the empress didn't punish, Melania didn't want her to punish anybody, so she didn't. But the empress appealed to the emperor, who then made a decree that all of the governors and all of the sort of the Roman bureaucracy in all of the provinces was to assist Melania to liquidate her wealth and distribute it as she wanted to. So you can imagine the corruption that probably ensued. But she could not do this without the might and the power of the Roman imperial bureaucracy. Now, you're this young rich man in Palestine. You go to the good rabbi, and you've got exceedingly great wealth, and he says, "Sell it all and distribute it to the poor." That's a complex problem, and maybe that because he wanted to obey the Lord, and he was just bummed that I can't go into sort of the next part of my life, which is to serve this rabbi. I got to go back and I got to manage my wealth some more. And it might take me years before I'm able to responsibly liquidate the wealth and responsibly distribute it to the poor.
Yeah. So let me piggyback on this because I actually do also have a take on this passage, which I don't think is combative with yours. I think it's complementary. So one of the things that I think becomes really clear in the Gospel of Mark in particular is I think the flow of story. Oftentimes we'll read parables and we'll read them in isolation. Whereas I think, especially in the Gospel of Mark, where it appears relative to other stories is also important. And so I'll give you an example that's not this parable, and then I'll apply it here. So one of the things that happens in the Gospel of Mark, you have the famous passage that a lot of people, obviously, it's one of these very famous, everybody knows it, sort of passages where Christ talks about let the children, come unto me and don't hinder them, and he says that we have to become like children, right, to enter the kingdom of God. And I've oftentimes heard people talk about, like, well, so what does that mean? And it just becomes sort of this open-ended free-for-all for whatever I might project on a child. But I think it's important that story is in proximity in the Gospel of Mark to blind Bartimaeus. Because one of the things about blind Bartimaeus, I'm one of the few characters who is, first of all, I find that one particularly interesting. You'll appreciate this insight because you also studied philosophy. One of the only characters named by Mark, only the ancillary characters given a name, and Bartimaeus, right? Bar, son of Timaeus, the Plato creation myth.
I never noticed that.
Yeah, son of Timaeus, son of Plato. So this is interesting. And one of the things that, of course, Bartimaeus does is he cries out. He's blind. So the son of Plato is blind. And he cries out for Christ to open his eyes, which in the Meno dialogue, when asked how you sort of, yes, on the one hand, Plato has the doctrine that dialogue, the right questions in the right order, open, trigger memory. But he also appeals to it being a gift from God, the awakening of the mind to understand the forms and ultimately the good. And so I don't think that's unrelated to the story of Bartimaeus who cries out for Christ to open his eyes. But one of the things that becomes really clear in the passage that I think is really relevant to the point I'm making here is that he is shushed, right, by the other people. When he hears that Christ is coming, he cries out, and the people try to silence him, and he cries out all the more. And I think it's very intentional that follows right on the heels of talking about let the children come unto me and that you have to become like a child. Because Bartimaeus, who is crying out for Christ, regardless of what anybody around him thinks, is childlike in his, reaching out to God. And so I think that's very intentional. I think blind Bartimaeus gives you the picture of what it means to become childlike to enter the kingdom of God. And I think there's another important proximity to the rich young ruler, is that there's a dispute right around this time about who will be greatest. And Christ tells them, if you want to become great, right, you have to humble yourself, right, that, the last shall be first, the first shall be last. And, whoever wants to be greatest needs to become the servant of all. And I think that's very much intentional, because then what we find is we meet a guy who has servants. Right? Now, what's interesting to me here about this parable is that, going to your point about what would happen if he were to sell everything he had and give it to the poor, he would become a servant to all. He would cease to be the one who rules over servants. He would be someone who ends up selling his wealth in order to serve other people. He would actually do the thing that Christ just told his own apostles. That's what you need. You want to be great in the kingdom of heaven. That's what you need to do. And this is what it looks like. Now, this ties in with something else that I think is really interesting, is that, there are a number of places where wealth and wealthy people come up in the gospel accounts. Obviously, this is a very well-known one. You already mentioned another one, which is Zacchaeus. And then there's also obviously the parable of, Lazarus and the rich man, which is another troubling one, right? And when I look at all of these things, I think it's right to point out that the ask of Zacchaeus is different than the ask of the rich man, right? This is one of the reasons why I think there's a tendency within our very sort of Western modernist approach to be deontologists, right? When we look at these things, and for those who don't know what that means, obviously this is Immanuel Kant's ethical system, where you have to create an abstract rule that applies everywhere to all people at all times and all this sort of stuff. And it's very rigid, right? It's notoriously rigid in the way it's applied. And so I think there's a tendency to want to look at Christ's dictates to different people and say, see, we fully abstract this. But when you look at the history and the lives of the saints, one of the things you see is it's really hard to do that, because the saints all look different. And so if you read, this is one of the reasons I think it's difficult for Westerners to read certain Eastern fathers like John Climacus, his Ladder of Divine Ascent, because they'll read about these weirdo monks who are doing really weird things, like standing out by a fence for a year, apologizing to everybody for, asking their forgiveness for, they're like, am I supposed to do that? Or this guy who never wanted to lay down. So he creates this apparatus so that he can even sleep standing up and never, be at rest and perpetually pray. And they're like, am I supposed to do that sort of thing? And there's a sense in which what gets lost is that the primary concern is the soul, right? The individual. It's not the exterior side of it, right? It's the transformation of the individual. And I think in a lot of these stories, the question is what's going on with the individual? Because I think there's a certain externalizing of wealth, as if wealth per se is evil.
Yeah, and that's not our tradition.
That's definitely not. And so one of the things, let's take the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. One of the things that I think is really notable about the parable of the rich man is, first of all, he never notices Lazarus, right? He passes him every day. That's one of the things that's specified in the parable. And what's also interesting is that in the parable, when he's in Hades, He never addresses Lazarus. He addresses Abraham. Why? Because Lazarus is beneath him. And then how he addresses Abraham is he wants Abraham to treat Lazarus like a servant, have him bring me something, right? And so what you're seeing in the parable of the rich man is that the primary sin is not that he has wealth. Once he's in Hades, he doesn't have any more wealth. The problem is that his wealth has shaped him in such a way that he sees himself as superior to others. He doesn't even see certain people like Lazarus. And when he does see them, he only sees them in a sort of servitude role. And so he actually does, his soul has been distorted. He's been spiritually blinded by that sort of thing. Whereas, and this is where I was talking about with Zacchaeus, where he's actually identifying like the main sin of the tax collectors, extortion, right? And I'm going to turn this around, make it a good investment. And so one of the things that I think is interesting is I think you're quite right to point out the logistical challenges of selling your wealth and giving it to the poor. But what I also hear that's interesting, and I'd be curious your reaction to this, is that when you describe it, I notice that you said again and again and again, just from like your own sort of thinking about it from if it were me, right? What I want to get to is following this guy around. Like, that's what I want to do. And one of the important things is that the moment he starts selling his wealth and giving to the poor, he actually is following, not in the physical sense, but now this actually is the salvific process. And so I think there's part of the thing that hasn't shifted in his mind yet, right? Just projecting here, right? But is that he's looking at the following as the thing I really want to do. And he doesn't realize that the salvific act begins long before that, in starting to liquidate his assets and give it out to the poor. This is actually the act of obedience to Christ, where he's starting to do the work of salvation there. And yet, rather than seeing that, he's just looking at the thing he wants to get to. I just want to follow you around.
Right.
That's the thing I want to do.
Exactly. And so what I think is also very interesting here, and listen, I'm just a person trying to follow Christ too, and I'm not a scholar, but it's kind of stunning to me that all of the commentary, the great saints, their commentary on this parable is that, essentially he loves wealth. He can't let go of his wealth, and turn and follow Jesus. It's sort of, they miss the complexity and the difficulty that the young man faces. But clearly Jesus knew. Clearly Jesus knew how difficult this was. Clearly Jesus knew how markets work. Clearly Jesus understood all of this. And so, to your point, maybe the divine sell order was specifically to send him on his own salvific path. And that the difficulty associated with managing the wealth was a form of ascesis that was going to shape his soul.
Right.
And as I said, kind of humorously, salvifically slim him so that it'll fit through that eye of the needle. Right. And then you see this with Melania, right? The church recognizes that her 13 or 30 year management of her wealth to distribute it to the poor as best she could, while trying to be an ascetic, was worthy of sainthood.
Right. Well, and this goes to one of the things that I think is really interesting, is that I think there's a temptation for those of us who have any sort of propensity for the life of the mind, for example, or for solitude, or for contemplation, or for prayer, or whatever it is, right? There's a tendency to want to, like, can I get past all this sort of to-dos so I can get over to that? And one of the things that is oftentimes missed in the process is how you treat your wife, how you treat your kids, how you treat your employees, all those sort of little things that are quote unquote not spiritual. How you handle those are actually also part of the spiritual life. That's part of the spiritual calling. But sometimes there's a certain sort of tunnel vision. It's almost this myopic way of saying, yeah, but I want to get to the spiritual stuff, as if there's nothing spiritual about it. And yet we're coming up on Lent here right now. And while Lent is always known for fasting and prayer and more services as we lead up to Holy Week, almsgiving is one of the critical spiritual exercises. So the giving to the poor was always seen as just as spiritually important in the early church as a spiritual activity, as fasting and prayer. And I think this is an interesting facet of it, because what that highlights is that if I'm correct, for example, that this archon would become the servant of all if he were to cease to be like, well, I'm trying to get rid of all this and I'm trying to figure out how to liquidate this so that I can give it to the poor and things like that. In this sense, he has positioned himself to be a servant of all, right? Obviously, Christ is the servant of all, right? But that really is an act of ascesis. I can't help but wonder if there's a certain, myopic tendency in him that's saying like, yeah, not just that it's a lot, but also it's like, that's a hurdle to getting to the spiritual stuff. I want to get to the spiritual stuff, which is walking around and listening to you, right? As opposed to saying your first and very important salvific act is this thing, where you start to move into almsgiving and handle your wealth, treat your wealth in a way that makes you the servant of all, right? That obeys this, right? That makes you a servant rather than, great.
But again, what I'd like to underscore is, even if that were true, I think people who don't have experience with great wealth,
right,
or great power, or great influence, right, any of these things that we associate with the elite, when they're genuinely trying to repent, or they're genuinely trying to follow Christ, or they're genuinely trying to be saved, it's a different kind of problem. And it makes sense to me that there's not a lot of writing on that, because who would know about that? I mean, the theologians or whatever, they tend not to have lots of experience in the business world or in the world of investments or managing wealth or whatever.
Well, this is why I found what you were writing so insightful, because, as a young man, I'm not that young anymore, but
You're much younger than me.
My life is more complicated than it was when I was younger. But, when I was first going down my spiritual journey and I wasn't yet married, I'm just reading philosophy and religion. The thought of giving up all I had and giving it to the poor. Well, let's say you're a college student, and your parents are paying your bills. And what do I have in my bank account? I'd basically say, hey guys, you can have my book collection, and it's a free for all. Take whatever you want, and I'll empty my bank account, the $200 I've got, and go give it to the bum on the street. And now I'm going to go follow Jesus.
Very romantic and easy.
It would be super easy, right? It would be super simple and easy. And even now, candidly, for certain people, it still would be relatively easy. And, if you own a house, okay, I got to sell that. But let's say you don't own a house. Let's say you rent and you've got some money in the bank and things like that. Okay, that gets relatively easy. Now this is why I brought up St. Anthony. Now, slightly more complex when you have people you have duties to. Okay, now I've got to set them up. Okay, that gets more complicated. But, and we have no idea, right?
Now you have businesses, right, and you have employees,
right,
and your businesses provide them with a livelihood,
right.
So when you were talking about how the rich young man or archon would become a servant of all because he has servants, one of the first groups of people he needs to be thinking about, right, are his actual servants. And if I just go sell all this stuff,
right,
what happens to them?
Right.
In fact, in the life of Melania the Younger, the biographer quotes her servants saying, don't do this to us. Please don't do this to us. And she does it anyway. So you could, you could take a sort of anachronistic critical look at this is the moral conundrums that come up, the stickiness, the webs of how wealth can cause you to veer off the path of salvation. because there's all these details and all these problems and all these duties and all this stuff. And you got to work your way through that. And it's not easy to work your way through that, to know, well, what's right? Is it, at what price do I sell it? Is 50% enough? Or do I have to hold out for the last dollar? I'd love to get into all the details of this, but it doesn't surprise me at all that this rich young archon, even if he wanted with all his heart to obey, and he doesn't get it. I bet he doesn't get it. I think you're right. I think he's confused and he's bummed, and he's like, oh man, I got to go back and keep doing what I've been doing. Oh, and this is going to be hard. It's going to take long, and I don't understand why this is what the Lord wants me to do.
So I think what I think is fascinating about this perspective on it is, I think it goes to the very thing that I'd mentioned earlier, that I think a lot of people who have gone down the business road and acquired wealth and have this sort of almost compartmentalized thinking, right? I think about business over here. I think about, I think about charity over here, and then I have my spiritual stuff over here, and maybe my charity is part of that, right? Or something like that. But, but it's kept in this sort of bifurcated, compartmentalized view. But let's play out for a minute. Let's pretend that he doesn't go away sad. Let's say he says, okay, and he goes away. And like Melania, he goes away and he actually does it. And let's pretend, like Melania, it takes him till the end of his life to do it, right? Now, the thing is, if that were the case, what would be fascinating is that even though he would go back and he would still have to manage his businesses, and he would still have servants, and he would still have wealth, the difference is it would all be salvific. The moment he's going back and laying his hand to the plow in that sense, he is now approaching it differently. And that difference is his salvation, right? And I think that's the thing that he doesn't get. He's like, well, that's a lot of work before I get to the thing that I want to do, which is follow you, right? As opposed to seeing that difference, that shift is his that's salvific. And I think that's the thing that you're putting your finger on that is really important, that hasn't really a lot of folks of great wealth haven't come to grips with, is that there is a way of looking at wealth and the responsibilities and wealth management and assets and all this sort of stuff that is ultimately salvific. And it's probably not the compartmentalized way of thinking about it.
No, and I think our secular society actually amplifies this. And that's another area to kind of delve into and research. But if you really think that religion is something you do on Sundays, and then you have your work week, which is what our society has encouraged for many decades, now everything's secular, right? You don't even have the Sunday the stores are closed.
Right.
It's everything's secularized now. It encourages you to bifurcate that, right? So the idea is, I have my work life and I do my work, and maybe I create wealth. Maybe that's one of the things I'm pursuing because I'm talented that way, and that's what I want to do. I'm speaking generally, not for myself. And then if I succeed, I'll use that success and I'll give to the church. I'll give to the poor. I'll put my name on a building. There's that later in life, I become philanthropic. That's the standard model.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You spend your career trying to succeed, provide for your family if you have a family, and then whatever excess you have, I'll wait till I can be very philanthropic. And I'll, maybe I'm giving along the way, but there's a whole question of how to do that. My point is that the journey of this, the ascesis, right? So I think of the difficulty of what this young man faces is like standing at the fence, asking everybody to forgive you. All of the ascetic disciplines that you read about that bring us closer to Christ, if you happen to be called by God to be in the world and not in a monastery or in the desert, what are those ascetic paths? What are those ascetic disciplines? And can money management be an ascetic discipline? And I think what you're saying is It can be.
Absolutely.
And you see in the life of Melania, it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm fascinated by how do we teach business people to think right at the start of their career? What are the practices? What are the difficulties? What are the challenges that you take on and you see that that's helping you develop spiritually and salvifically?
Right. Yeah. So just a couple of things. I think one is just we've used ascesis a couple of times, and just in case people aren't familiar with that term, right? It's the word from which we get exercise, and so essentially it's a training, spiritual training, ascesis, spiritual exercise, right? Training, and so the ascetic life is this life where when people were known for fasting and going around and not wearing shoes and only owning one bowl, that think like weird things like that. That was always considered ascetic, which we tend to think of as deprivation, but it's not synonymous with deprivation. It's primarily associated with training. And so the people who did that, right, they were trying to train themselves spiritually, put to death the passions, raise the soul up to God, right? Those sorts of things. And so when asking whether or not wealth management and things like that can be ascesis, right, is asking whether or not it could be. And my answer is absolutely. Like if I play out the story where the rich young man says, yes, okay. And he never gets back to following Jesus because Jesus is raised and ascended before he even finishes. That's what would happen. Right. Probably. Right. If it happens, he would still be saved the moment he turns around because the moment he's starting to do that, everything has shifted in terms of how he's approaching his wealth and his businesses and everything else toward his salvation, right? He has started to do the act of obedience. He has started to move down the road that's been laid out for him. That's one thing. The other thing is, and I think this goes to, my jab on deontology, which is there's an important doctrine in the Eastern Fathers, the doctrine of the logoi, right? So everybody's familiar with the logos, right? Like that Christ is the Word of God. But there's this other peculiar doctrine of the logoi. Most folks who have come across it because of Maximus the Confessor, but it's there before him. And essentially what it is it recognizes, it's similar to the sense that Plato had talked about the idea that there are these archetypes, these abstractions, these forms, these ideals. But all of Plato's forms that exist in the mind of God, for the Neoplatonists, right? These forms that exist in the mind of God, they're generics: square, circle, dog, cat, human, right? But the Eastern Church Fathers recognize, well, wait a second. If these are the archetypes for what God makes, and the individual, right, the individual Chuck, or Nathan, is something that God makes, then does he have an archetype for what Chuck is supposed to become or what Nathan is supposed to become? And the answer is yes, right? And incidentally, and so that becomes the measure of whether or not I'm becoming not just generically a good human, right, a properly formed human, but whether or not I'm being formed in the way that God intends. And so there's a recognition that even though there's a certain commonalities between you and I, we're both human, and we can talk about a properly formed eye for a human that applies to both of us. We have idiosyncrasies, and those idiosyncrasies are by design. And that's why even though all of the saints become saints, none of them look the same. Some look like healers, some look like theologians, some look like people who are giving away a lot of wealth to the poor. Right? They all look different. And those are the logoi, right? Those are the words of God that form the world, that reside within the logos, within the word. And the reason I think that's so important is because the sort of the tendency toward deontology is a tendency to want to say that the path to salvation looks identical for everybody. And that's why I think so many Westerners who encounter the Eastern Church Fathers, they struggle because they're like, well, so many of the saints became monks. And they're like, so am I have a deficient form of salvation if I'm not a monk? And the answer is no. Marriage is just as good of a path to salvation as being a monk. And so I think it's an important thing to say, to notice that Christ wouldn't tell, the college student with $200 in his bank account to sell everything he has. And he might tell him to follow him. You can leave the $200 in your bank account, right? But for the rich young man, the wealth is a significant part of his salvation. And I think you're right that it's too superficial to say because he's greedy, right? No, it's that almsgiving is a significant part of the salvific, act. As we think about it, it's an ascetic exercise. And so somebody who has those sorts of resources has the opportunity, has a road laid out for them because of their uniqueness, right? That's his aptitude.
And that's right. And what I find fascinating is that Jesus uses the term, he doesn't say the rich are damned or the rich are lost or the rich can never get into heaven. He says it's going to be difficult. It's difficult for the rich. He doesn't say it's impossible. He does later say, the apostles say, well, then who can be saved? And, what's impossible for man is possible for God. It's almost as though, look, these are difficult things, but with God, they can be overcome. They can be turned into a path of salvation. And so it's the very difficulty of the attachments of wealth. If you go off by yourself and you have to deal with yourself in the desert, there are different kinds of difficulties. If you immerse yourself in the world and you have a lot of attachments, but you still, Lord, what else do I need to do to be saved? And he says, essentially, detach yourself from this, but do it well, do it as a servant of all, do it, Christ-like, and that becomes a path to salvation.
Right. And that is a consistent theme throughout the Fathers, the idea that the sufferings, the trials and the sufferings we face are the tools by which we are saved.
Yeah, we're being hammered.
Right. So Athanasius's difficulties are going to be very different, than the rich young man's difficulties. My difficulties are going to be different than yours. But each of those is there for our salvation. I mean, that's a very clear theme throughout the Eastern Fathers, is that the difficulties we face are ultimately there as the instruments of salvation.
And what I find is we don't have a lot of, so if you think this way and you want advice and you want to understand and somebody is a business person, it's not obvious how to connect those dots in my day-to-day life and what it means to be a business person. And that's what the this contemplation on this essay sort of led me to think, how do we lay out a path of ascesis for the business life just the way it's been laid out for the monastic life, for instance?
Yeah. Well,
lots of tools, lots of examples, lots of.
Yeah, and I think there's a principle that's really valuable specifically with this sort of issue that we're talking about, which is that with the Eastern Fathers, and John Climacus is a good example of this. One of the first steps in the spiritual life. Now, granted, the Ladder of Divine Ascent, it's written for monks. John Climacus is very clear, but that said, there's plenty of wisdom in there, even if you're not a monk. And one of the things that he talks about is detachment. And something that he says, which is very important and very instructive, is that he points out that just because you got rid of your stuff and go into the desert, that doesn't mean you're detached. And he actually makes the point that it is possible for somebody to be in the desert pining for the world and the stuff they left behind, and in that sense, they are attached. And it's possible, the inverse is also possible, for you to be in the world, have the stuff, but
detached.
But you're completely detached from it. And you see a similar sort of point with Gregory of Nyssa when he talks about virginity and things like that versus marriage. At least in some places, he's using that in an allegorical sense. Somebody who is married is attached to the world. Somebody who's virginal is someone who's detached. And so he'll say things like, "Yet, though I've never been with a woman, I'm not yet a virgin," right? Because he's using it in this attachment-detachment point. And so it's really critical because I think another thing that happens, this is one of the reasons why I focus on the condition of the individual, right? The difference, like the rich man in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, is because there's also a tendency in some of the, I think, mishandling of these texts to look at it in a purely extrinsic sense. It's about the wealth. or it's about the poor or something like that. Whereas, yes, Christ is concerned with the poor, but when talking with the rich young man, his primary concern is the rich young man. It's your soul that I'm concerned with. And so in this sense, the act of ascesis, it's not about whether he still has wealth, how quickly can he get rid of it's about him and that detachment from it and the reorientation toward God and the servitude of others and seeing the image of God in others. It's the shift in his own soul that is so critical, not the size of his bank account.
Yeah, but I think even that's kind of abstract. When he goes back, so let's say the rich young man is going to obey Jesus, and that's why he turns around. But his face is fallen because he's thinking, boy, this is not what I expected. This is going to be tough. It's not what I wanted. Goes back. And as soon as he starts thinking, okay, so now I have all these servants. What am I going to do? Where am I going to sell this? And by the way, which poor am I distributing to? And how do I do that fairly? And how do I do that the way God? Those details, those administrivia even that he has to deal with, they're such a pain. It's at that level. And so we've got to connect those dots.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I love about how you describe it, right? Because the average person who doesn't have a great deal of wealth is never going to think about that difficulty. But the very fact that as you start to catalog the types of difficulties he'll face, it reorients everything toward how do I take care of these servants? How do I take care of these poor? How do I do this well? There's been a massive shift in his entire orientation to how he lives and handles that, as well as, truthfully, a detachment from it. Because now he's no longer seeing it really as his. In which these are some of the things that I think, like people like Basil of Caesarea, my own patron saint, are oftentimes misunderstood. So Basil says, for example, if you have 2 cloaks and your brother has none, you've stolen from him, right? And people go, see, he's a Marxist. We should go in and take your coats, right? Which again, it misses the point that Basil's not concerned with how many coats are in circulation. He's concerned about the fact that you have 2 and you're not even mindful of the fact that there is another person who has none, right? So with all of these things, again, and you see the same thing with Chrysostom's when he talks about wealth and things like that. He's rough, but at the same time, if you see what he says about King David, right, who he acknowledges as a man of great wealth, he's absolving him basically because he's saying, on that bed, he's wetting it with his tears of repentance and things like that. So Chrysostom is, again, even though it's very easy to take these characters and take these fathers and the things that they say and cram them into some social agenda or something like that. I think the critical feature is that in all these cases, they're not utilitarians. It's not about building a utopia of equal halves or something like that. It's about salvation.
It's all about salvation.
It's all about salvation. And so in that sense, it's oriented toward the individual. So in that light, I just want to, and I think we should probably wrap up here, but I do want to say, on a practical level, right? If you were to, and I know this is sort of new that you're going down this road, let's not talk about anybody else, right? Let's just talk about you, Chuck. Okay, you're not exceedingly wealthy, right? Getting. I don't think your annual income is somewhere around $2 billion. No, but nonetheless, as you think through this, I think we've already hit on the basic principles, but how does it begin to reorient the way you think about your own wealth management? And I'll just say this. I've known you for years now, right? And I can see why you resonate with the rich young man, because I think I know you well enough to say that you would happily be like, oh yeah, can I just go study philosophy or go to the monastery and do these sorts of things? That same sort of impulse to be like, let's get past the wealth management part and get to the good stuff is something that I think you resonate with.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I've felt like I've never been able to get to that. I've never been able to sort of follow the apostles there and, get my feet dirty and walking around with Jesus. I've felt like because of the duties and the attachments and that come along with this, come along with trying to do it well. Okay. And this is the other thing is you can be attached and it doesn't cause these problems. It doesn't cause this tension, because you're very attached and you're very focused on that. And you're not paying attention to, say, duties to others. So, it's almost a cliche, right? But like a Milton Friedman approach to what is the purpose of a corporation or business? It's to maximize profit for shareholders. I mean, almost nobody believes that anymore in America. I mean, there are people who do. I shouldn't say that, but that's certainly not being taught at the best business schools anymore. Sure. It's much more complicated than that. And so if that's the only thing you're focused on, it's a lot less difficult.
Right.
Than if you're focused on, I got to generate above average returns to my shareholders, but I've also got to make sure that I'm being responsible to the community and to my employees and to the other stakeholders in my business. It's not necessarily for philanthropic reasons. It's good business, right? We've learned that, you end up eating your seed corn if you're always mistreating employees or if you're polluting the environment that your business is in. It's just we're just hurting ourselves and screwing up our own economy, which long term is going to hurt us, right? So anyway, good leadership, good management is being taught where you have to be aware of more. Well, that's a lot more difficult.
Right.
Then all I got to worry about is the bottom line.
Right. Well, and it gets a lot more difficult if then you say, and I've got to do all that while trying to figure out how to orient myself toward giving this away for the benefit of others for my own salvation, right? The sort of reorientation that we've talked about with Rich Young Men. If you now have all of those things in mind, where it's not just as simple as like, just offload everything, but doing it in a way that accounts for all those things while also counting for your own salvation, right? Your own soul, your own formation, your disposition toward wealth, detachment, all the rest. Now that's exceedingly more difficult. Mm-hmm. Right. So, well, excellent, Chuck. I appreciate the conversation. And I'm sure there's much, much more to be said and written on this, but I'm glad you're doing it because like I said, I think we saw on the ground that there's a certain compartmentalization about these things that doesn't really sort of take into account the type of dynamics that we've discussed. But I think those are the true biblical dynamics if you're going to talk about what Christ and then the fathers after Christ who took this seriously, how they see these matters. So a lot more to be done, but I appreciate the talk.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
It's great being with you.
I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow, subscribe, hit like if that's an option on whatever you're listening to. All that sort of stuff really helps us out here. So I greatly appreciate your support. And until next time, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.